In 1894, a gaunt hermit came down off the North Ridge to warn a Kentucky hollow never to ring the old church bell after midnight. The people of Vance Hollow wrote him off as a lost mind, a man who had lived alone too long. He said it the way a man says a thing he has already paid for breaking once. They laughed, until the night the bell rang with no hand on the rope and the church doors stood open in the dark. What came after that night made the whole hollow reckon with the thing the hermit had spent his life trying to keep buried. There is a kind of silence that only lives in the deep folds of eastern Kentucky, and Vance Hollow had more of it than most. The settlement sat in a long trough between two ridges, where the sun arrived late and left early, and the mist came up out of the trees like cold smoke off a dying fire. The land was steep and stingy, the kind of ground that grew just enough to keep a family alive, and not a spoonful more, and the people who chose it were the kind who wanted to be left alone more than they wanted to be comfortable. No paved road reached the hollow in 1894, and none was coming. The only way in was a dirt track that turned to red clay soup after a hard rain, and the families who lived along it were scattered so far apart that a walk to a neighbor's place could take the better part of an hour. In a place like that, the church was the one roof that held the scattered families together, the single shared wall where news traveled, where the dead were mourned, where the year was marked by weddings and funerals, and the long winter meetings that were as much social as they were religious. The old frame church sat at the head of the hollow, on a flat shelf of ground above the creek, built in 1838 by the founding Vance family, the same year they laid claim to the whole valley. It was plain, hand-hewn, the kind of church that leaned a little into the hillside and smelled of pine sap and lamp oil, no matter the season. The bell in its tower had hung there since the day the church was raised, cast and hung the same season, the only bell the hollow had ever known. In the mountains, a bell like that carried more than sound. It carried the news of who was gone. When someone died, the sexton went up into the tower and tolled the bell, and each ring stood for a year of the dead person's life. The families down the hollow would stop whatever they were doing and count the rings out loud, sometimes standing in the yard in their work clothes with their hands still on a hoe or a bucket, and that was how they learned who had passed in the night. A long string of slow rings meant an old soul who had lived a full count of years. A short string meant someone had been taken before their time, and the silence that followed that count was heavier than the ringing. There was an older custom behind it that most of the hollow had half forgotten by then. In the old country and in the first years of the settlements, 3 bells belonged to a death, not one. The passing bell rang while a person was still dying, a warning that a soul was on its way out, and the living should ready themselves. The death knell rang. Once, the life was gone, the sound that said it was finished. The lich bell rang at the funeral itself, when the body was carried to the church door, and the mourners met it there. By the end of the century, most of that had worn down to 1 bell and 1 sexton, but the feeling underneath it hadn't worn down at all. A bell rung after dark belonged to the dying, and the dying belonged to a world the living didn't want to be reminded of. And Vance Hollow had one rule about that bell that nobody had written down. You didn't ring it after midnight. The oldest people couldn't say where the rule came from, only that it had always been there, the way the mountains had always been there, the way the creek had always run cold. It had the feel of an old wives' scrap, half respected and half ignored, the kind of thing a grandmother mutters over her work, and a young man forgets by the time he reaches the road. Most of the hollow had stopped asking why a long time ago, because the asking made people uncomfortable in a way they couldn't name. A few of them never knew the rule at all, and that was its own danger, because a rule nobody remembers is a rule waiting to be broken. The man who wouldn't let them forget was named Mordecai Hale. He lived in a sagging cabin halfway up the North Ridge, where the old trail thinned to a deer path and the pines closed in over the roof until the place looked like it was growing back into the mountain. He was gaunt and weathered in a way that made his age hard to place. Somewhere past 60, with a face like a dried apple, and hands that had worked the same soil for so long they had taken on the color of it. He kept to himself the way a man keeps to a wound, and the hollow had learned to leave him to it, He came down off the ridge only to trade a few pelts for salt and meal at the store by the creek, or to stand in front of the church and repeat his warning to anyone who would hold still long enough to hear it. He always said the same few words. Do not ring that bell after midnight. Do not, no matter the reason, no matter who has died, no matter how bad you want to mark it. He said it flat, without explanation, the way a man says a thing he has said so many times. The edges have worn smooth, and there's nothing left but the bare shape of it. Then he would turn and go back up the ridge without waiting for an answer, because he had learned over a lot of years that no answer was coming. The town had made its peace with him, the way a town makes peace with a stone in a field. They walked around him. The younger men, led by a cocky 22-year-old of the founding family named Judd Vance, mocked him openly, called him the Ridge Ghost, dared each other to ring the bell just to watch his face when he came down and found it had been wrong. Judd's friend Boyd was louder about it than the rest, the kind of loud that comes from fear a man won't own, and the two of them together could turn the hermit's warning into a kind of joke that the whole hollow told on itself to keep from thinking about it. The elders didn't laugh, but they didn't stop the laughing either, and that was its own kind of failure. They shifted and looked at their boots when Mordecai spoke, the way people do when they suspect a thing is true and would rather not have to say so. One old woman didn't look away. Aunt Mariah was the granny woman of the hollow, the one who knew the old customs and the old cures, and the names for the things people had stopped naming. And when Mordecai said his piece, she would go very still and watch him go back up the ridge. That stillness of hers was its own kind of answer, and the men who noticed it didn't like it, because it meant the old woman who knew the most believed the man they had decided to ignore. The mountains had always made men like Mordecai, and the hollow knew it, even if they didn't say so. The hermit was a real figure in those parts, a documented type, the self-imposed exile who knew the folds of the land too well to leave and too well to be at ease among other people. The old newspapers and travelogues were full of them, eccentrics and recluses who lived on the ridges until they became part of the geography, half legend and half neighbor. Most of the hollow saw Mordecai as one more of those, harmless oddity, a man the mountains had chewed on, a little too long. What the hollow didn't ask, because it didn't want the answer, was why a man who had been the church sexton, the one who rang the bell for every death in the valley, had walked away from that job and gone up the ridge to live alone. They remembered that he had been the sexton, the one who climbed the tower and told out the years. They didn't ask what had happened the day he stopped, because asking would have meant the rule had a reason, and a reason was the one thing nobody wanted to give it. It was late October, the corn in and the first frost on the higher ground, and the young men were restless in the way that young men get when the work is done, and the dark comes early, and there's nothing to do with their hands. Judd Vance had been drinking at a still, back in the timber, with Boyd and two others boys from the south slope, and somewhere in the drink, the hermit's rule became a dare. Judd said he would ring the bell at midnight and prove the old man a fool in front of the whole hollow. Boyd said he would go with him. And the two from the south slope came because backing out would have cost them more in shame than the dark cost in fear. They took the track up to the church just before midnight, 4 of them, with lanterns that threw their shadows long and broken ahead of them on the trunks of the trees. The cold had a sound to it that night, the kind of quiet that makes a man hear his own blood in his ears and the crunch of his own boots like something following him. None of them said much on the climb. The drink was doing the talking for them at the start, and the drink had begun to thin out by the time the roof of the church showed black against the stars, and when the drink thins out, the dark gets bigger. They came around the last bend in the track and stopped where the lantern light reached the front of the church, and what they saw stopped the breath in all 4 of them at once. The doors of the church were already standing open. They had been shut at sundown, the way they always were, and no one had been up the track since the women left the churchyard that afternoon. But the 2 doors hung wide, and beyond them the inside of the church was nothing but a dark, so complete that the lantern light seemed to lean into it, and not come back the way water leans into a drain. Then they heard the bell. It was ringing, The rope hung straight and still in the open doorway, untouched, swaying the smallest amount from the vibration in the tower and nothing else, and no hand was on it. Above them the bell swung on its own, slow and heavy, and the sound it made was the half-muffled, mournful note of a bell rung for the dead. One clear strike, then a soft choked echo, then the clear strike again, the way a bell sounds when leather has been wrapped around one side of the clapper to mark a passing. It was the sound of a funeral, and there was no funeral. Judd stood in the open doors and looked in, because the drink was still in him enough to make him brave, and not enough to make him smart. He would never say exactly what he saw, not that night and not any night after, only that the church wasn't empty, the way an empty church is empty. There was a shape in there, or the sense of a shape, a thickness in the dark that had a weight to it, and a draft that moved against the lantern flame the wrong way, toward the inside instead of out, as if the church were breathing in. Boyd grabbed Judd's arm, hard enough to leave a bruise, and the four of them went back down the track, faster than they had come up it, and they didn't stop running until the church was behind them, and the dark was only the dark again. Behind them the bell stopped on its own, the way it had started, without a hand and without a reason anyone could name. The hollow went quiet. The doors stayed open, and they would stay open for a week, because no one in the hollow could bring themselves to walk up and shut them. The first sign that the night had cost something came 3 mornings later, when the boy who brought kindling to old Horace Tally found the old man dead in his chair. Horace lived alone at the far end of the hollow, where the track gave out, the way a lot of the old men did by then. He was found sitting upright, with his cold hands on the arms of the chair, and his eyes open, the way a man looks when he has been surprised by the thing that took him. There was no mark on him, and no sickness anyone had known about, the kind of death the mountain calls natural because it has no better word for it. He was old, and old men die. That was the easy story, and most of the hollow tried to tell it to themselves in the first days, because the easy story let them sleep. The hard part was the bell, because the bell didn't toll for Horace and no one rang it. The sexton's job had been empty since Mordecai went up the ridge, and there was no one to climb the tower. Still, the bell should have rung, because that was what the bell was for. That was the whole point of a bell in a place where people lived too far apart to call to each other. Its silence was worse than any sound it could have made. In a hollow where the tolling told you who was gone, a death with no toll was a death. The bell itself had decided not to name, and that was a thought no one could hold for long without turning it over, and finding something worse under it. Then the small wrongs began to stack up. The way they do when something has been loosened, that should have stayed shut. A clock in the tally house that had kept good time for 20 years stopped at the hour Horace died and wouldn't start again, no matter how many times it was wound. A dog on the south slope wouldn't stop howling at the north ridge, the long flat howl that the old people said meant. A death was still moving through a house and hadn't finished its work. On a porch near the church, a rocking chair moved in a windless hour, slow and even, with no one in it, the way a chair moves when someone has just stood up from it, except no one had been sitting there. Aunt Mariah went through the hollow naming these things the way her mother had before her, the old death omens, and the naming of them didn't make anyone sleep better. It made the omens real by giving them a place to stand and a name to answer to. Mordecai came down off the ridge on the 5th day, and this time the town couldn't laugh him off, because the look on his face wasn't the look of a man who had come to say, "I told you so." It was the look of a man who had been waiting for this his whole life, and was afraid of it anyway, the way a doctor is afraid of the sickness he always knew was coming. He stood in front of the open church doors and told them it had started, and that it wouldn't stop on its own, because a bell rung at midnight was a call, and a call that had been answered didn't go quiet just because the people who made it wished they hadn't made it. The hollow split open along its old seams, the way a dry log splits when the frost gets into it. Half of them were afraid and wanted to do whatever Mordecai said to make it stop. The other half were angry, and their anger was easier to wear than their fear, so they put it on like a coat. They blamed the hermit for bringing the trouble down on them with his years of glooming and his talk of rules, as if a man could summon a thing by warning against it. Judd Vance, who knew what he had seen in the open doorway, wouldn't speak of it at all, and his silence was louder than the others' shouting. Because the others were shouting to drown out what they suspected, and Judd was quiet because he had stopped being able to doubt it. Only Amariah went to Mordecai and listened to him without arguing, and the two of them stood by the church for a long time, with their heads close together, while the rest of the hollow made noise around them, and what they said to each other no one else could hear. It was Aunt Mariah who got the story out of him, and she did it the only way it could be done, by bringing him inside the church itself, into the open doors that no one had been able to shut since the night the bell rang. The hollow followed because they had run out of anywhere else to look, and because a man who has been afraid for 5 days will follow even the person he was mocking the week before, if that person looks like he knows something. They stood in the cold nave, with their hats in their hands and their breath showing in the air, while Mordecai Hale stood at the front of the room he had once run, and he told them what he had never told a living soul. He had been the sexton. He said it like a confession, because for him it was one. The worst kind, the kind where the thing you confess is the thing you did right before, the thing that ruined you. For years he was the man who climbed the tower and told out the ears of the dead, and he knew the rule, and he kept it, the way a man keeps a vow because keeping it was the whole of his job, and the whole of his understanding of himself. He rang the passing bell and the death knell and the lich bell for every family in the hollow. He never once rang after midnight, not once in all those years, until the night he couldn't help himself and the not helping cost him everything he had left. His wife Ruth had taken sick with a fever in the spring of an earlier year, and she went fast, the way the fevers took people in those times, fast and without warning, the way a storm comes over a ridge. She was dead, or she looked dead, and the grief took his legs out from under him in a way he had no defense against. In the middle of that night he went up to the church alone, with the hollow asleep and no one to see him, and he rang the bell for her. He rang out her years, one toll for every year she had lived, and he broke the one rule he had kept his whole life, because he wanted to mourn her, the only way he knew how, and he was past caring what it cost. A man past caring what a thing costs is the most dangerous man there is. The doors opened, he said it plainly, the way a man says a thing. He has relived so many times, it has no edges left and no surprise left in it. The bell didn't stop when he let go of the rope. It kept ringing on its own, the slow muffled toll, and the doors of the church swung wide, and something was in there with him, or something had come up into there out of the ground, and he saw the shape of it. He wouldn't say what it was, not to the hollow and not to Aunt Mariah, only that it was a thing that shouldn't have been there and that it knew him. He only said that he lost more than his wife that night, and that what he lost was the reason he went up the ridge and didn't come down for years, and the reason he came down after that only to keep anyone from doing what he had done. That was the whole of his life on the ridge. He told them, a man standing guard over a sound, repeating a rule he had earned the right to repeat in the worst way a man can earn anything, by paying for it with the people he loved. He hadn't gone up the ridge because he was mad. He had gone up the ridge because he was the only one who knew what the bell did, and the only one who knew had to be the one watching, because no one else would believe him, and belief was the only thing that would keep a hand off that rope. Then he told them the part that turned the whole story in their hands, and made the room go so quiet you could hear the creak through the wall. The bell wasn't the source of the trouble. The bell was the seal. It had been hung over something on purpose, the way a stone is set over a grave to keep it shut and to mark it, and ringing it at the passing hour, the hour of the dying and the dead, was the one thing that loosened that seal. The trouble in the hollow hadn't started the night Judd went up the track. It had started the year the church was built, and it had been waiting under the bell the whole time, patient, the way the dead are patient for someone to give it a voice. And what had been waiting, Mordecai told them next, was older than any of them, and older than the bell, and it had a name, and the name was what the hollow had spent 56 years trying not to say. The story of how Vance Hollow became Vance Hollow was a story the Hollow told itself in a cleaned-up version, the way a family always tells its own story, with the rough parts sanded off and the shame left out. The founding Vance family came into the valley in 1838 to settle it and put a church at its head and a name on the place, and from that name came everything else, the families that followed, the marriages, the children, the graves in the churchyard. That was the version the Vance men told, and the version the Hollow was comfortable with. Mordecai gave them back the rough parts. The Hollow wasn't empty when the Vances came, and the not empty part was what had been left out. A man was already there. He was a squatter and a recluse who had lived in the folds of the ridge for years before any settlers saw the place, kin to the older mountain folk who had been in those parts longer than anyone counted or cared to count. He had a cabin and a clearing and a good spring, and he had no interest in selling any of it or in leaving it for a family, with a name and a plan and a church in their baggage. He told them no, the way a man who has lived alone too long tells people no, plainly, and without softening, and the no was the last word he got to say about his own home. The founders wanted the hollow whole, and a whole hollow needs clean ground and a clear title, and the recluse was in the way of both. What happened next was the part the Hollow never wrote down and never passed on, except in the rule that lost its reason over the years. The recluse was killed. He was buried at the head of the Hollow, in the exact spot where the church was going to stand, and the church was built over the grave the same season, and the bell was cast and hung directly above it. Nobody wrote his name on the stone, because there was no stone. Nobody rang the bell for him, because ringing it for the man they had killed would have been the same as saying out loud what they had done. The bell was the seal and the cover in one, and that was the clever part and the terrible part. It turned a dead man's grave into a church's voice, so that anyone who heard the bell heard holiness instead of a killing. The rule about never ringing it after midnight was the founder's guilt passed down until it lost its name and became superstition. The way a wound becomes a scar, and a scar becomes a story, and a story becomes a thing nobody believes. Ring the bell at the passing hour, the hour that belonged to the dying and the dead, and you called up what was under it? That was the whole design of the rule, to keep the seal shut and the dead man down, and it had worked for more than 50 years, until the night a grieving sexton broke it, for love of his wife. Mordecai's connection to it was what made the town go quiet in a different way than the fear had made them quiet. He was the last of the recluse's blood. He was a grandson, raised on the secret but not on the sin, given the rule and the sexton's job in the same hand, the keeper's burden without the keeper's crime. The family that killed his grandfather gave his family the job of guarding the grave, and they called it an honor and a living, and the Hales had carried it ever since. The way a family carries a thing it can't put down and can't explain. That was why Mordecai knew what the bell did, and why he had stayed on the ridge above the church his whole life, watching a sound, because the only thing harder than knowing a secret like that is being the only one left who knows it. The Hollow heard this and didn't want it, and the not wanting was almost louder than the bell. The Vance name was on the Hollow, and on the church, and on most of the good land, and on half the graves in the yard. To believe the Hermit was to indict the family that had built the place where every one of them had been baptized and married and mourned their own, and a man in the back of the church said it was a lie, and he said it too loud and too fast, and the loudness was the tell, because the truth doesn't need to be shouted, and a lie almost always does. Aunt Mariah looked at the man who said it and didn't argue with him, and the not arguing was worse than any argument, because it meant she had already made up her mind, and he hadn't. The town broke into 3 pieces over what to do, and each piece hated the other 2, and the hating was easier than the deciding. One group wanted to destroy the bell and be done with the whole thing, pull it down out of the tower and roll it down the ridge, and let the Hollow go back to its business and never speak of any of it again. A second group wanted to dig under the church and see the truth with their own eyes, because a story this big shouldn't be believed on the word of one old man, no matter how long he had carried it. The third group, led by the older Vance men, wanted to drive Mordecai back up the ridge and shut the story up before it got down the mountain, because a hollow built on a murder couldn't afford to have the murder spoken of in the open light where anyone could hear it and repeat it. Then the bell tolled again, and this time it was broad daylight, and the daylight was what broke the last of their nerve. A thing that comes in the dark can be called a dream, but a thing that comes at mid-morning while the sun is on the yard has to be called what it is. The sound came down out of the tower at mid-morning, while the men were still arguing in the yard. A single heavy note that stopped every voice at once the way a gunshot stops a room. The doors of the church, which someone had finally managed to shut the day before, swung open again on their own, slow and even, the way a door moves when the draft changes, except there was no draft. That afternoon, a younger man was found dead at his own table, a man not old and not sick, and the hollow had its third death inside a week. The old rule of threes, the one Aunt Mariah had been counting on her fingers the whole week, and a voice no one wanted to hear, had come true in the flesh, and the flesh was one of their own, and not an old man at the end of anything. Aunt Mariah went home and covered every mirror in her house with cloth, the way the old custom said, so the dead couldn't look back out of the glass at the living and call them across. She stopped every clock in the place, the way you did when a death was in a house to keep another death from following the first one through the door. She told the families on the south slope to tell their bees, because the bees carried the news of a death in a hive that wasn't told would swarm and leave, and a family with no bees in those hills was a family with no sweetness for the winter. She had done these things a dozen times in her life and never once believed they would be the thing that saved anyone, but she did them anyway, because the doing was all she had, and the doing was the way the living kept some order over a thing that had no order to it. Judd Vance broke, the boy who had mocked the hermit the loudest, the boy who had stood in the open doorway and seen the shape in the dark, went up the ridge to find Mordecai, and the boy who came back down wasn't the same boy who went up. He asked Mordecai, in a voice scraped raw and quiet, how to stop it, and the asking was the first honest thing Judd had done since the night on the track. Mordecai told him the part the Destroy the Bell camp didn't want to hear and couldn't afford to hear. The bell couldn't simply be broken because the bell wasn't the wound was the unmarked grave. Silence, the bell in the grave was still there, unnamed and unowned, and the hollow stayed cursed in a quieter way. The kind of curse that doesn't ring but doesn't lift, either, the kind that settles into a place and stays for generations. There was one fix, and only one, and Mordecai had known it the whole time he had been standing guard. They had to dig. They had to find the bones under the church and bury them again, this time right in the churchyard with a stone and a name, and they had to toll the bell in the daylight as a proper death knell for a man who had been dead 56 years and never had one. A man the hollow had killed and buried and built a church on top of, and never once rung for, because ringing for him would have been the same as admitting what they had done. That was the only thing that would close it, and the closing would cost the hollow its story about itself, which was the one thing they had been protecting all along. They dug at the head of the hollow, just inside the open church doors, where the old floor met the earth, and the whole hollow came to watch, because not coming was its own kind of confession, and no one could afford to be the one who stayed away. The Vance men came too, and their coming was the hardest thing any of them did that year, harder than the arguing and harder than the fear, because to stand at the edge of that hole was to stand over a grave their own family had made, and to know it in front of everyone. Mordecai stood at the edge of the hole and directed the work in a voice that had waited a long time to give that order. Judd Vance dug. The same Judd who had run down the track with the bell ringing behind him, now working a spade in the dirt. His family had sealed more than half a century before he was born. They found the bones deeper than they should have been, set down in the old way, the bones of one man laid in the earth with nothing on top of them and nothing around them. No marker, no shroud, no name, no coin for the crossing, nothing a man is supposed to be given when he's put in the ground, because the men who put him there hadn't been burying him, they had been hiding him. Mordecai looked at the bones and didn't speak for a long time, and the whole hollow stood quiet and let him have the time, because the time was his and they owed it to him. When he did speak, it was the name of his grandfather, a name the hollow hadn't said out loud in 56 years. And he said it, the way a man says a name he has been carrying alone too long, and is finally allowed to set down. The bell above them tolled once on its own, as the spade turned the last of the dirt. A single heavy note, the half-muffled mournful sound of a bell that knows what it's for, and then it stopped. It didn't ring again after that, not that day, and not any day after. The doors of the church, open for a week, closed on their own that evening, gently, the way a door closes when the air in a room finally settles, after a long disturbance. And the closing was the quietest sound the hollow had heard in days, and the most welcome. After that, the omens stopped. The way a fever breaks, the clocks ran again. The dog on the south slope lay down and was quiet, and the rocking chair on the porch by the church didn't move again. They buried the bones again, this time in the churchyard with a stone, and the name Mordecai gave them, and they tolled the bell in the daylight as a death knell for the man who should have had one in 1838. Mordecai climbed the tower himself, the old sexton going back to his post one last time, his knees loud on the worn steps, and he rang the years out, one by one, counting them himself in a voice that shook only once. The hollow stood in the yard and counted with him every family, the way they had always counted the years of their own dead. It was the first honest toll the bell had ever given, and the sound of it wasn't the sound of a curse or a warning. It was the sound of a debt being paid, late and terrible, but paid. Mordecai didn't come down off the ridge again after that, but he was seen at the grave once, standing in the daylight with his hat in his hands. The look on his face wasn't the madness the hollow had blamed him with for years, and the shame they had used to keep from listening to him. It was the look of a man setting down a weight he had carried his whole life, and the carrying of it had been the only life he had ever had, so that the setting down was both a relief and a loss at the same time. He wasn't the mad hermit after that day. He was the keeper, and the keeping was done, and a man whose keeping is done is a man who has to learn what to do with the rest of his days, and that's its own kind of hard. The bell in Vance Hollow hasn't rung on its own since, and the rule is still kept, but now the town knows what it's keeping and why it keeps it. Every hollow has a bell and a story it would rather not tell, and the hermits up the ridges are not always the crazy ones. Subscribe if you want more of the stories the mountains kept quiet, and share this with someone who needs to hear it.